Great. Thanks so much, Patricia, and thank you all for joining me on this Friday afternoon to learn a little bit more about the intersection of stalking and intimate partner violence. As you know, I'm sure, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, so we think it's important to highlight the relationship between stalking and intimate partner violence all year round, but it's especially great to think about that and look at the domestic violence work that we're doing in October through that lens of stalking. So I really appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit more about that today. My name is Dana Flightman. I am from the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, which is a project of Equitas. We are fully funded by the Office of Violence Against Women. So we provide technical assistance and training to all grantees or potential grantees of OVW. So that includes most campuses, law enforcement offices, domestic violence organizations. So I hope that if we haven't had the chance to speak before, I'm so glad that we're connecting now, and I hope this is one of the first and not last times that we're touching base. So please feel free to follow up and reach out anytime. We're happy to help you. Our website is www.stalkingawareness.org. We have training modules, including ones you can lead in your own community that are more public awareness oriented, as well as those that are more for professionals in the field. We have resources for victims, including a brochure on stalking and safety planning guidance. We have practitioner guides for professionals, and they're broken out by profession. So we have for law enforcement, for corrections, for victim advocates, for prosecutors, for awareness educators, as well as webinars and recorded webinars like this one. We try to practice what we preach and not send too many emails, so you can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and our handle on there is at Follow Us Legally. If you get our sick sense of humor at Spark, and if not, it'll be a long hour for you. So really, your call. I'll keep talking either way. I'm curious about who was able to join this afternoon. So Patricia, if you could pull up that, thanks so much. And folks, let me know, what discipline do you most closely identify with? Of course, we know that a multidisciplinary response is essential to responding to domestic violence, sexual violence, as well as stalking. So I really appreciate all of you and the important work that you do. So I'll give you just a few seconds to fill that out. Okay, great. It looks like we have a mix. We have some victim advocates, a prosecutor, and some DVAM and SA program staff. If you're in that other category, if you could go ahead and type in the chat box what profession you identify with, just so I have a sense of who's here. So thanks so much for doing that. So today, last week, we offered a webinar called Context is Key, Recognizing and Responding to Stalking, and that was a deeper dive into the contextual nature of stalking as well as stalking behavior. So if you haven't listened to that already, I really encourage you to do so. What I'm going to do today is a quick refresher on the behavioral definition and the contextual nature of stalking. So for folks who have been there, done that, it'll just be a quick refresher, and if it's new to you, then it's good for us to all just kind of be starting from the same place. And again, I encourage you to go into the archives and listen to the past sessions as well. Then we'll be talking about the intersection with intimate partner violence, the risks posed by intimate partner violence stalkers, or intimate partner stalkers rather, and then just a few tools for risk assessment and safety planning. So why talk about stalking? So stalking is one of the 4 crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. It's always that and stalking. We almost called our website andstalking.org because it's something that's so often an afterthought in our field, unfortunately. And I hope by the end of this webinar, you're recognizing just how much stalking impacts the victims and survivors you're already working with, either moving that a little bit to the beginning of the sentence. And it's one of those things we're, quote unquote, supposed to be dealing with. But beyond that, we want to be recognizing stalking because it is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It is a crime at the federal level in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and U.S. territories, on tribal lands, and in the military justice system. It is a misdemeanor or a felony depending on the jurisdiction and the circumstances of the case, but it is a crime everywhere. A lot of folks don't recognize that stalking is a crime. So you have victims saying, well, what am I supposed to do, call the police because some guy rang my doorbell? You know, and the answer should be yes if that's part of a stalking course of conduct, because stalking itself is a crime. And I'm happy to talk to you more about the statute in your state if you're interested in that. And stalking is traumatic. So a lot of times when we talk about how important it is to recognize stalking, we go right to that co-occurrence with physical violence and lethality. And that is really important. I'll talk about it in just a couple of slides. But I also want to pause here and recognize that even if stalking is the singular thing that a victim is experiencing and it does not co-occur with physical violence or assault, that it is a crime in its own right because it's a deeply traumatic experience that can have lifelong impacts on victims and survivors. So many stalking victims experience mental health issues that can be lifelong. Quite a few lose time from work. 1 in 8 lose time from work, and more than half lose 5 days of work or more. And very few states offer protection to domestic violence victims in the workplace, even fewer for stalking victims. So sometimes if a stalking victim does reach out to the employer for some additional accommodations or protections, for example, you know, can I not be the first one to answer the phones, or can I switch my shifts, or I need to take time off to go deal with the situation. In most states, employers have the right to let that employee go. And so a lot of stalking victims do see either they lose shifts and income, or they might even lose their jobs entirely. And 1 in 7 stalking victims relocate. They choose to move as a result of the stalking. And that really shocked me the first time I read that, because just think about how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? You've decided to pack up your family and pack up all your things and call the movers, and how expensive and stressful and what an ordeal that can be. We have 1 in 7 stalking victims making that choice as a result of their victimization. So I think it just goes to show just how consuming and traumatic stalking can be. It's always great to hear from survivors in their own words. This is a quote from one that says, "It's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." And this is a really typical quote. Stalkers can be very persistent and are intentionally creating the impression that they're everywhere all the time. And so plenty of survivors have told me, you know, I knew he'd call the day he got out of jail or the day that his probation ended, and he did. So whether it's actual or just the impression, a lot of stalkers create the feeling that they're always watching, they're always there, they're always waiting to come back again. And stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including rape. About 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or harm their victims, and 76% of intimate partner femicide, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of those attempted homicides, there was stalking the year prior. In fact, this one researcher we work with said it really well, that stalking is homicide in slow motion. Of course, not every stalking case results in homicide or leads to homicide, but it's these early signs that so often get missed that we want to be paying attention to, particularly in the intimate partner relationship when there's stalking present, because it should be a big red flag that this victim is in danger. And yet less than 40% of stalking victims report to law enforcement. And of course, this is similar to domestic and sexual violence, where it's quite underreported. This is for a variety of reasons, again, that are similar to for those other crimes. Shame, distrust of the police, embarrassment, feeling it's private or personal. And in the case of stalking, as well as sometimes for those other crimes, a lot of victims aren't aware that a crime has occurred. So they're thinking, well, how can I call the police about just this, you know, weird, creepy thing that happened, not recognizing that it really is a crime. And even when they do reach out to the criminal justice system, it's extremely, extremely undercharged. So in this study, it's a study done in Colorado, there were almost 2,000 cases of domestic violence. Almost 300 involved stalking, so that's 1 in 6 where there was documented stalking. tell me in the chat box if you can guess, how many cases do you think ended up being charged as stalking? How many do you think through law enforcement got that stalking charge? 2, 2. I guess 2 is the number today. 5. Yes, this C. So with the initial CL, you are right. It is 1. Only one of these cases was actually charged as stalking. But I appreciate all of your pessimism. Usually the guesses are much higher. Yes, only one of these cases was charged as stalking. So it's underreported, and it's also, when it is reported, undercharged. And, you know, we think a great deal of that has to do with just the lack of education on stalking and not really seeing these crimes through a stalking lens. So what is stalking? There's the behavioral and the legal definition. We're going to focus on the behavioral definition today because you're coming from all different parts of the country, and the legal definition can vary quite a bit. And that, additionally, even if you find, looking at your statute, that it's a high threshold and you can't charge or prosecute stalking, I still think it's really important to understand the behavioral definition, because in order to best safety plan with victims and recognize what stalking really is and what stalking really looks like, we want to understand behaviorally that definition, so it's not just dependent on the statute. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So it's a pattern of behavior, which is also called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. Typically that's 2 or more incidents. So you might hear me kind of use pattern of behavior, course of conduct interchangeably. I'm really talking about the same thing. It's directed at a specific person, so it's not whoever walks by. It's not being a peeping Tom who looks into a locker room, for example. That might be criminal, but that's not stalking. Stalking is following a woman to that locker room, right? It has to be directed at a specific person, and it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really important to understanding stalking, and it's actually what separates stalking from a crime that's often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is typically this kind of repeated behavior that would make a reasonable person feel angry, annoyed, frustrated, and harassment can be quite serious. So I'm not trying to minimize that in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. For example, if my employer was really degrading to me in meetings and had really unrealistic expectations of me and started name-calling me at work, I might feel very harassed and angry and disrespected, and I should definitely go to HR about that. I'm not necessarily afraid of her. I'm just like, wow, this is the worst supervisor, right? But then if she started following me home, sending me, she texted me a picture of myself walking my dog saying, why are you doing that instead of working? Okay, now I'm scared, right? So harassment can be part of a stalking course of conduct, but that fear component is really important to understanding stalking. And we're saying, well, fear of what? Some statutes specify that it's fear of bodily harm or harm to somebody close to the victim or property, and some are more broad, and it can be any fear. So it'll depend, but that fear piece is really important. Context is very critical in stalking cases because, like I said, fear is so important, but that's tough because what's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. So, for example, there was a stalking case where this woman called the police hysterical. All she would say was, there's a cup of coffee in my car. And so, understandably, law enforcement's not sending out the SWAT team on this. You know, they're kind of like, you prefer tea? You know, what is your problem? And eventually she said, he's here. It turned out this was an abusive relationship that had ended, and then the ex-boyfriend had begun stalking this woman. She had relocated, address confidentiality, really thought she had covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that morning, gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So I can't see or hear you because of the webinar format, but typically when I tell that story in person, people make a kind of like, sort of noise. And that's because a reasonable person would feel fear. But we need to know what's going on. We need that backstory to understand why what happened is scary. Because often the behaviors that are frightening to a victim may not seem scary to us as an outsider. They might seem benign or even nice. The classic example is a stalker saying, I'll send you roses the day I kill you, right? And then the victim receives roses and is terrified, and the people around the victim are saying, oh, that's so nice, you got flowers, right? Because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. Only the victim in that example would know that, oh, this coffee cup was this is the place we used to go together, and this is his old nickname for me. Only the victim who got the flowers would know about that threat before, unless she told somebody else, right? And so those meanings are not always clear to us as responders. So it's up to us to ask the right questions and think, could this be fear? Could this be stalking? And ask, what message did that send to you? What did that mean to you? And context is also what makes a lot of the stalking behaviors criminal in the first place, because it criminalizes otherwise non-criminal behavior. It's not criminal to send somebody text messages. It's not criminal to send somebody gifts or flowers. But those behaviors can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. And a lot of times stalkers combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, for example, vandalism, with ones that are not crimes on their own, like excessively texting or driving by somebody's home, which can be confusing for everyone. Stalking is extremely prevalent. Over 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men experience stalking in the course of their lifetime in the United States. And this is using a really conservative definition of stalking, where the respondent said they felt, quote, very afraid that they or someone close to them would be physically harmed. We're still seeing rates this high. So if you think about the rates of domestic violence in America, it's around 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 women, depending what study you read. Sexual assaults just on campuses, about 1 in 5 women. And so stalking is really right up there in terms of prevalence, and yet it's something that, it's always that and stalking, right? It doesn't quite get as much time, space, or training in our field. So when I Google stalking, which I do because I'm fun, these are the kind of images that I get. So there's a lot of these sort of shadowy, hooded, presumably strangers kind of lurking from behind. I like this one in the middle where this guy's wearing a hoodie and a mask and behind a computer, but did not cover his webcam. That was my favorite. It kind of implies these dark, shadowy, hooded strangers. And I'm sure it will not surprise you all to know, since you're all in this field, that the vast majority of the time, the victim knows the offender. So again, I don't expect that to surprise you, but when I'm talking about stalking outside of our field, in front of parties and stuff, people are shocked by this, because when most people think about stalking, they're thinking about celebrity stalking. They're thinking about Taylor Swift, thinking about the Kardashians, and indeed our stalking laws do actually originate from a celebrity stalking case, Rebecca Schaeffer's murder in the 90s. And so celebrity stalking does happen, but that's really not what we're talking about, in the work that we're doing. But there's that myth around it where folks think that it's only happening to celebrities, but usually it's people that we know. About half the time, it's a current or former intimate partner. So that's true about 43% of the time for male victims and over 60% of the time for female victims. So about half the time overall, it's a current or former intimate partner who is doing that stalking behavior, who is that stalking offender. Well, that's what we're going to focus on today, is that half. But I do want to make the point really quickly that that also means about half of stalkers are not current or former intimate partners. So a lot of times our stalking response is housed under our domestic violence response, and that's not wrong, but it is a bit incomplete, because while that's what we're focusing on today, I encourage you to think about, are you serving all victims of stalking? If not, do you know where to refer them? If you are, that's great. Would they know how to find you? Because if I was being stalked by, again, let's say my employer, it's unlikely I read out to something called the Family Violence Center or the Domestic Violence Shelter, right? Because it's not that. So I encourage you to think about that, because for better or worse, a lot of times the stalking response is completely under the domestic violence response, which is not always intuitive. So why do they stalk? They're similar to why do abusers abuse, why do batterers batter. There's no consensus in the field or in the research about why folks engage in these abusive or stalking behaviors. There are these stalker typologies, but we don't like to use those too much at Spark. They have things like the rejected stalker, the romantic stalker, because the truth is all stalkers are dangerous. Their motives are often conflated and can change, And we don't want to say, well, this is who the stalker is and here's how dangerous they are and what they will or won't do. That being said, we do see some common motivations for stalking, especially within intimate partner relationships. So one is seeking affection. They could be trying to establish a relationship in the first place and pursue a romantic relationship. A lot of it's power and control. A lot of it is about controlling that person, and it's an extension of domestic violence. It might be after rejection. Either they tried to initiate a relationship and were rejected, or after a breakup. Sometimes that's when the stalking begins, either to punish the victim or to try to show the victim they were wrong, or again, some conflation of the two. Obsession, we do sometimes just see obsessive stalkers. When it's obsessive in a mental health way, it's more likely to be a stranger or celebrity stalker, but it can happen among people who know each other. They may be planning to commit a crime, and so they're stalking to learn more about the victim's behavior, habit, schedule to commit a crime, and that can happen with intimate partners as well. So perhaps they're following their ex-partner around to see, oh, did she change jobs? Where is she working now? Where does she park? That kind of thing, because they're planning to commit a kidnapping, for example, or a sexual assault. And honestly, a lot of it's because they can. A lot of stalkers stalk because they very often get away with it, and they toe the line between what's apparently to most people criminal and what isn't, and they manage to really terrorize their victims in this way. And of course, we want that to stop. So I, again, appreciate your work every day and for joining the webinar so that we can better identify these behaviors and make it so that's no longer the case, that they can get away with this. So stalking as intimate partner violence. I'm curious, just in the work that you do every day, about how often are you working on intimate partner violence cases? So Patricia, if you could pull up that poll there about how often folks are working on domestic violence, or it could be dating violence if you're working with the younger population. Do you say daily, weekly, monthly, annually, rarely? So I'll give you just a few seconds to fill that out. Okay, so it looks like most people are saying, yep, daily, weekly, I am working on domestic violence, which makes sense for the professions that you identified, right? Okay, same question, but now for stalking. About how often are you working on stalking cases, would you say? Daily, weekly, monthly, annually, rarely? I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. Okay, so as you can see there's a big shift, right, where before over half were saying daily domestic violence, but about half of you are saying rarely or annually for stalking. And that's really typical that folks are working on stalking cases quite a bit less. So I appreciate you sharing that. But the truth is, if you're working on intimate partner violence cases, you are working on stalking cases, because so much intimate partner violence involves stalking. If you think back to our friend the power and control wheel, which identifies different types of violence, in our field, a lot of times I'll hear people say it was an abusive relationship, and then she, because often a she, left him, and then he began stalking her. And that can happen, but also let's roll that back a little bit. If during the relationship he was tracking her, following her, showing up at her workplace, calling and emailing her excessively, asking friends and family where she was, that's domestic violence, it's emotional abuse, and it is stalking. It is both of those, and that can be happening before, during, and or after a relationship. So I know about half the time it's happening during the relationship as well. So sometimes it does happen that the relationship, there was no stalking during it, it only started after, but over half the time it was happening during the relationship. And so it's really important to recognize that and call those behaviors stalking. And there's so many of them that when you really think about it through the lens of stalking, behaviors that would cause reasonable person fear, that include often multiple contacts as well as monitoring and tracking. I mean, think about just, this is a study of workplace intimate partner violence perpetration behaviors, okay? It's just, so it's the prevalence and consequences of intimate partner violence intrusion in the workplace. I don't believe the word stalking is ever used in this article, and yet look at the behaviors that we're describing in terms of the most prevalent intimate partner violence, workplace perpetration. Contacted, threatened, or harassed supervisor and coworkers, appearing at the job site, surveillance at the job site, so watching the person while they're at work, and telephone calls to the victim or coworkers at the workplace. So that sounds like stalking to me, right? It's that contact, repeated contact that's invasive, that is invading the victim's life and making it hard for them to get through their day. And it's also quite scary that they're showing up everywhere that they're not safe. So, of course, these behaviors aren't just limited to work, but when I'm looking at a study like this about domestic violence behaviors, I find it really helpful to think, well, is that stalking? And you might be thinking, well, okay, that's like an intellectual exercise, but does it really matter what we call it? I'm already doing this great work around domestic violence. Why do I need to call it stalking? But there's a really practical reason, and that's that because it's very difficult to criminalize a lot of these behaviors listed here, as well as what we tend to call emotional abuse, right? A lot of times if we try to do something about that, law enforcement will say, well, no one's been physically hurt yet. You know, it's not illegal to be really mean to somebody, so there's nothing we can do. But if those emotionally abusive behaviors include things like this, repeated contact, surveillance, in-person appearances, tracking, monitoring, that's domestic violence, and it is stalking, and stalking is a crime. So it actually has the potential to criminalize those behaviors that otherwise we feel that we can't do anything about. So I think it's a really powerful thing to recognize. I'd also to add that when I hear the term, digital abuse or technological abuse, we're also typically talking about stalking there. We're talking about, in that case, they're talking about within a relationship, intimate partner stalking. So that's really what we're talking about. We have a video with just a couple examples that illustrates this. Again, the word stalking is not used, but I encourage you to just listen to these stories from survivors and think through the implications there.
He used to put a recorder underneath my seat when I drove to work because I used to pick up a mate. While I was at work, he'd come down and get it out of the car. I suppose to listen to what I'd been discussing when I went and got a protection order on my own. No one knew. I was ashamed. One of the conditions on the order is that he can't have anything to do with me on social media. So some of the breaches on the protection order were from Facebook, and he's put stuff up there about me. Tells people I'm an old psycho bitch and that I've always had problems. He's got open Facebook so everyone sees it.
He was like a watchdog. He had this habit of putting USB sticks and recording devices and stuff like that all the way throughout the house. I confronted him and I said, "Why have you done that?" And he said, "Oh, I was just wanting to see how you were doing, whether you were happy." And I said, you could have just asked me. In the house, I didn't feel safe anywhere. No privacy whatsoever.
So in these cases, clearly these women are describing domestic violence, stalking. And when we think about stalking behaviors, there's wonderful researcher T.K. Loven who has this framework where she divides them into 4 categories. There's surveillance, which is how is the stalker tracking, monitoring, watching, gathering information on the victim. Life invasion, which is how is the stalker showing up in the victim's life where the victim does not want that stalker to be there. Intimidation, which is how is the stalker threatening, either implicitly or explicitly, that victim. And interference, what is the victim losing or afraid of losing as a result of the stalking behavior? And I think in these examples, we really see all of those coming together. We see that surveillance, that it's invasive, that in that first one in Fiona's story, she's trying to have a relationship with her friend. She's trying to drive to work. She knows she's being watched. She knows she's being monitored. She has to watch what she does and doesn't say. In that second story with Leah, that she's in the home. There's no privacy. It affects her ability to feel safe in her home, to have that relationship. So all of that, it's really all of those, surveillance, life invasion, and quite threatening, even if and that's hard because in a lot of stalking statutes, again, they require fear. So a stalker may not be saying, I will hurt you, I will do this to you, but the fact that a stalker is, consistently breaking into somebody's home or vehicle and leaving a recording device or planting cameras all over the home that they share, that can be quite intimidating as well, because it's letting them know, it's letting the victim know, you can't get away from me, I will see everything that you do, and I can find you, and I'm watching you, right? So it's really all of those. When we think about barriers to leaving an intimate partner, a domestic violence relationship, we get that question, well, why doesn't she just leave, that I know we're all so sick of getting. And of course, there's many answers to that question. This is a helpful way just to kind of think about it and to realize that when there's stalking involved, it makes it even harder to leave that relationship. So we like to think of the F's here. So fear, certainly, violence can escalate when a victim leaves a relationship. And stalking, if there's been stalking in that relationship, then the victim knows that, well, this person can find me, they can get to me, they can access me. Stalkers often create the impression that they're everywhere, that they know everything, and so they can really deflate a survivor's sense that they can get away from that abuser and that stalker, right? They're really afraid of what they might do, how they might escalate. Finances, so a lot of times intimate partners share finances. When it comes to stalking, a lot of times stalkers gain access to victims' online accounts, including bank accounts. And so when they do that, they can, destroy credit, take out withdrawals, open bank accounts, close bank accounts. A lot of times stalkers will just either hack into an account. Intimate partner stalkers might pressure the victim to give them the credentials or password, or they might share the account in the first place, or sometimes they can infer it by just saying, forgot password, and going through those security questions. And, those are things we tend to answer truthfully because we want to remember them, because we can't remember our passwords. So things like, what was your father's, middle name, or what was your first make and model of your car? An intimate partner stalker is likely to know that and be able to just get into an account, financial or otherwise. And so certainly shared finances, being entangled, being financially dependent, all of that, plus a stalker's ability to access somebody's financial accounts can make it harder to leave. Father, if they're married and or they share a child in custody, it's very difficult to disentangle from that offender. A lot of times through shared custody, stalkers see any contact as a win. And so the custody situation can be really difficult because if a victim is mandated to continue some kind of contact with the offender, they can really abuse that to try to continue to contact them, talk to them about things outside the scope of what they're being allowed to technically talk about. So that it makes it hard to leave because they feel like, well, the kids need a father. And if there is that continued shared custody, then there's always going to be some kind of relationship, which typically gives some kind of hope for that stalker. Family, a lot of times a victim, not always, but often a victim might be coming from a family that was abusive or that's been normalized, and so they may not have other great models of what a healthy relationship looks like. And of course, they want to keep their family intact. With intimate partner stalkers, they're likely to share the same social networks as between victims and offenders, and so that family and friend network can be really hard to get away from, really embarrassing to explain to everybody what's going on. Also, a lot of times stalkers do what we call proxy stalking, which is where they stalk through somebody else. So they might be asking friends and family about that victim. Oh, did they end up moving? Did they get that degree? What are they up to now? Where are they working now? And family doesn't always know the situation. A victim may or may not want to disclose that to family. And so sometimes that network that at one time that intimate partner was part of the family or is part of the family extended can be really challenging in that relationship piece and getting away from them. Faith, so they feel that they need to stay with the person, and also that faith and fantasy all kind of combine that the stalker or the abuser will change, right? Will stop that behavior, that if they can prove to the abuser who's also stalking them that actually they are happy enough or they are loyal or they're not really cheating, that person will go back to who they felt they used to be. So all of those are barriers to leaving a relationship in any domestic violence situation. And all these barriers are made even more challenging with the addition and presence of stalking in that relationship. You've probably all heard the statistic. It takes an average of 7 times for a victim to leave an abusive relationship. So what's that really about? You know, that 7 times trying to leave. It's really about stalking. And unsurprisingly, victims of intimate partner violence stalking have more separation attempts than victims of intimate partner violence who are not experiencing stalking. Because when they try to leave, they're drawn back in one way or another. And that repeated unwanted contact that's scary, that scares somebody into coming back into a relationship is stalking, really, definitionally stalking. I also encourage you, if you look at anything titled breakup violence, that's stalking, right? It's about somebody contacting the victim repeatedly after when it's unwanted and scary and trying to get them to come back. And so it's, I think, unsurprising that stalking victims have an even harder time with this. So, okay, these are both happening quite a bit at the same time. A lot of intimate partner violence is actually stalking. Again, in addition to criminalizing it, why does it matter? You know, why do we need to know that? Well, another big reason is that intimate partner stalkers, on average, pose the greatest risks of any stalkers. And intimate partner stalkers, if you think about it, and I've already mentioned this a little bit, they make really effective stalkers because they have information, access, and shared social networks. They know a lot about the victim, and because stalking is often so personal and contextual, they know what'll really get to that victim, because really, who knows us better than our intimate partners, right? And so they know, and I just read a case where the victim had an eating disorder, and so the offender, you know, decided to sign her up for all these weight loss forms and Weight Watchers, for example, because he knew this history of the eating disorder, and that was a way to get to her that a stranger or an acquaintance may not know about that history, but he did, right? And so that kind of information, as well as the information and access of shared accounts. So a lot of stalking happens through the use of technology. It might be bank accounts, smart devices, anything like that, finances, you know, and because often intimate partners share accounts, share information, they have access to that online. They might just, and it's easy for a victim to forget, oh yeah, I guess they were on that account, or I guess we were on that joint phone plan, especially if the victim doesn't expect the offender to become an offender, right? They don't expect that person to be stalking them or misusing the technology or access in that way. It can be easy to forget how much access that person really does have, that, oh yeah, they do know the garage door code, and I guess I should have changed that, but I didn't think about it because I didn't think they'd come, right? Or something like that. As well as those shared social networks. So often they have mutual friends, they might even be part of the family, and so they can ask those mutual friends about the victim's behavior and access the victim. Sometimes those social networks make it so that the victim has to see the offender, even if they're trying to avoid them, or the victim faces the choice of, do I want to tell everyone about what's going on here, or do I want to miss this party? And then, of course, it affects their, you know, their social life and their relationships. And offenders utilize this too, including through the use of technology. So if they have a shared social network, let's say through something like Facebook, even if the victim maybe blocks the offender might be able to say, oh, but our mutual friend is still friends with the victim, and let me just check in with them and see if through their page I can see, did the victim RSVP to this event, or are they seeing anyone new, or something like that. Intimate partner stalkers, on average, pose the greatest threats to their victims. Now, all stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely, but they have an increased risk when there's an intimate partner stalker. So more so than other stalkers, they're likely to physically approach the victim in person, be insulting, interfering, and threatening. They're more likely to use weapons, have their behaviors escalate quickly, and while the recidivism rate is high across the board for stalking, it's even higher for intimate partner stalking. In fact, the average duration of an intimate partner stalking case, not the high end, the average is 2 years. So these stalkers, again, can be quite persistent and engage in a variety of behaviors to continue to terrify their victims. And when somebody is experiencing abuse and stalking, the abuse itself also tends to be more severe, and the abuser tends to be more persistent. So this was a study of women with protective orders, and among the women who had the protective order, they were twice as likely to have that order violated if there was stalking going on than if there wasn't any stalking going on. So again, that stalker intimate partner tends to be really persistent. We're also seeing, again, that the abuse can be more severe when the intimate partner is also a stalker. So I know this is a lot of information, so I'll break it down for you. This was a study of women with protective orders. It was about 750 women. And so all of them had been in abusive relationships or were in abusive relationships, and it asked if they had experienced stalking in the year prior. So some were still with that abuser, some were not. And here, across the board, when women experience stalking in addition to that abuse, they're experiencing more verbal abuse, degradation, jealousy and control, serious threats, moderate and severe physical violence, sexual insistence, sexual violence, and injury. And if you look, some of these numbers are very significant, where, for example, sexual violence, about 17%, it's almost twice as likely when that woman was stalked. So, of course, for the women who are not stalked, they're also experiencing these abusive behaviors, but the rates are much higher for women who are being stalked, and that continues here on this chart. The only exception on this chart is physical assault, which is interesting, but for the rest of them, if the woman was beat up, if the abuser threatened to kill her, threatened her with a weapon, attacked her with a weapon, or committed a sexual assault, attempted or completed, the stalked women are experiencing this a whole lot more. And look especially at that threats to kill, much higher for the stalking victim. They're twice as likely to be attacked with a weapon as the women who are not stalked. And so these are significant additions. And so when we see that there's stalking in an intimate partner violence case, not only do we want to identify that because it could be a different charging or prosecution option in terms of criminalizing those emotionally abusive behaviors, but we also want to know that because it's an increased risk for our victims. And so when we're seeing stalking in an intimate partner violence case, whether it's during the relationship and or after the relationship, that a light bulb should go off that, wow, this could be a really high-risk case. And like I said at the beginning, this includes homicide as well, where in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted homicide, where a male partner murdered or tried to murder a female partner, there was stalking the year prior to that attack. So it's something that we definitely want to be recognizing at all parts of that relationship. It also, of course, abuse is traumatic for victims and survivors on its own, and different victims and survivors have different responses to domestic violence. But in this study, they found that women in the stalked group had significantly more post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety symptoms compared to women in the non-stalked group. And this was after controlling for just about everything: age, race, population, duration of the relationship, severity of the abuse in the relationship. Even after controlling for all of that, it was that stalking that led to significantly more and longer mental health impacts. So it is a unique behavior that has unique impacts on victims and survivors. So again, why name stalking? I know I've said some of this already. Charging and prosecution options, so not only to criminalize that emotionally abusive behavior, but it's also a great charge for prosecutors, because if they're prosecuting a domestic assault or domestic battery or simple assault or whatever it might be called in your jurisdiction, generally it would be challenging for that prosecutor to bring up, you know, that time 2 years ago when the abuser sent a bunch of creepy text messages, right? Because it'll be argued that's prejudicial, that's not relevant to this assault that just happened. But if you're charging stalking, you can bring in that entire course of conduct. So you can paint a much fuller picture of the extent of abuse in that relationship, because now all of that's fair game, both the behaviors that were criminal on their own, like perhaps vandalism or robbery, as well as ones that were not criminal on their own, like those text messages or showing up at somebody's place of work. And so I've definitely had a lot of prosecutors say, oh yeah, they convicted on the stalking behaviors, not on the assault, because again, those stalking behaviors, they're diverse, they're creepy, they're so personal, it's like you can't make this stuff up, so that can be a really powerful charge that way. So it's great to just give prosecutors the option so they have a menu of different charges. And also stalking is a really powerful charge because you can bring so much in. Safety planning, stalking is its own risk for those intimate partner violence victims and survivors. We want to know that and safety plan around that. And it can be empowering for victims because when victims come to you who are experiencing stalking, they're probably not going to call you and say, hey, I'm experiencing a course of conduct that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. I believe you call that stalking, right? They're not going to say that. They're going to say something more like, my ex has gotten creepy. My high school sweetheart's been making things really awkward lately. My boyfriend's being weird. That's what they're going to say. And it's up to us to be able to think, could this be fear? Could this be stalking? And it can be empowering where instead of saying, oh yeah, this person was being awkward or kind of weird, to actually have victims be able to voice, like, I'm experiencing stalking, and this is a real thing. It's a real crime. It's a real experience, and I can find resources for that. So I think for all those and more reasons, it's not just an intellectual or semantic exercise to say, oh, call it stalking, because that's what it is. It also has some very real implications in terms of keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. So like I said, there's an elevated risk for these stalking victims in an intimate partner violence relationship. So how do we assess the threat here? There are more dangerous times, and these are similar to for domestic violence cases, even those that don't include stalking. It could be separation when the protective order is served. So, you always want to ask the victim, how do they think that the offender will respond if a protection order is served? Some victims will say, oh my goodness, they'd be so embarrassed, they will stop this behavior immediately. And some victims will say they won't care at all. They'll just be angry and might escalate their behavior. And of course, we do see that happen. So you always want to ask the victim how they feel it'll impact the offender and how the offender might act. But when we see that protective order served, if there's been a criminal arrest, if there's even if it's not through a protective order, if a victim sends a law enforcement officer or themselves voices to the offender, please do not contact me anymore, that can be great in terms of building a case and showing that the contact was definitely unwanted, but it also can elevate the risk there. If there's loss of job or other life events, passing of a family member, as well as an anniversary, we often see that, like an anniversary of a divorce, or a wedding anniversary, or the first time whatever happened, that an offender a stalker might show up again and again. And of course, if we're seeing an escalation in behaviors, we want to pay attention to that because we don't know how much it might escalate. So you may be using, wherever you are, some kind of threat assessment, which is a great thing to use. This is an example of one, and there's several of them. There's Mosaic, this is LAP here. And so basically how this one works, it's for domestic violence. And if a victim answers yes to one of the first 3 questions, they automatically get a protocol referral to a victim advocate, right? So if it's weapons, threats, or will they try to kill you? So if they say yes to any of those, okay, this is a high-risk case. Or if they have at least 4 responses that are yes to questions 4 through 11. So this is a great tool, and of course we want to take all our domestic violence cases seriously, but it's great to be able to filter some high-risk ones out. The only thing with this, though, is that only one of these is really, well, all of these could happen in a stalking case, absolutely. It's not the best at identifying stalking behavior specifically, because only really question 11 is actually specifically about stalking. Do they follow or spy on you or leave threatening messages? And perhaps constantly jealous or control most of daily activities, that could be stalking, it could not be stalking. So it's not that this assessment's bad, it's a great tool, it's just that it's really measuring domestic violence and not measuring stalking, and that means that sometimes we're missing stalking, even though when stalking's there, we want to be saying, wow, this is a really high-risk case, I see the stalking, what should I do about it? So there's actually a risk assessment specifically for stalking, and this is for intimate partner violence and for non-intimate partner violence cases. It's free online at coercivecontrol.org, and you can also find a link to it on our website. It's developed by the same researcher, T.K. Logan, who develops quite a bit of other great research and tools on stalking. And so what this will do, it is a short assessment. It's a little too long for your responding officers on the scene, but it takes about 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes maybe. It can be filled out by the victim advocate, victim's friends, or a detective, someone with a little bit more time. And it asks a variety of questions because when we're looking at stalking, sometimes we can be quite incident-based in our field. A victim comes in, they're worried about one thing that happened, so we safety plan around that one thing, or we file a report around that one thing. But with stalking, the behaviors can be so expansive and varied. We really want to ask all the right questions and get all that information for the entire course of conduct, but it can be hard to remember to ask all those questions and know what to ask. So this has a bunch of questions, including it measures the duration of the stalking, how has the victim resisted it. For example, did they relocate? Did they change their number? Have they gotten a protective order? As well as the persistence of the stalker. Have they been persistent? It measures the basically duration, intensity, and frequency of the stalking, and it pulls out after a narrative report as well as those safety planning suggestions. So of course those safety planning suggestions don't replace the individualized safety planning that a victim would do with a victim advocate. That's really important, but it does give a good starting point, and I know some victim advocates use that as kind of a launching point and then write additional notes and their information on there. The narrative report's also really helpful because it gives a succinct summary of the stalking case. These cases can be long and they can be so many incidents, and we don't always do a great job explaining to victims how to document it. So it's a great source document that you can use to help get a protective order, to share information in your coordinated community response, obviously with the victim consent. Also, it provides a third-party perspective where, the victim might be minimizing the situation. Like a law enforcement officer the other day told me that they had a stalking victim who called them at 9 a.m. and said, "Today's a great day. He only's driven by my house 9 times." And they said, "Well, it's 9 a.m. Said, "Oh, yeah, but usually by this point of the day, he's driven by like 30 times, right?" And so that third-party perspective that says, here's everything that's been going on can also be kind of sobering and feel like it's giving a little bit more of a like a quantitative measure of just how severe the stalking is. Of course, what we need is coordination, right, which is so much easier said than done. And I know it's really easy to pay lip service for coordination. It's harder to do. But especially for a stalking case where almost definitionally it's about crossing jurisdictions, right? So we have, a victim, like I live here in D.C., so easily a victim could have a job in Maryland, but then actually they live with their intimate partner in Virginia, but all their friends live in D.C., and that's where they hang out on the weekends, right? So, and a lot of these times what we have are different professions and different jurisdictions knowing different information. So the prosecutor knows something, the victim advocate knows something, law enforcement over in Virginia knows something, law enforcement in D.C. knows something else, but no one's connecting the dots. And bringing it all together and really seeing the full course of conduct and seeing just how scary this might be. So we need our prevention awareness educators to educate folks on stalking when they educate about intimate partner violence so that the general public knows what stalking is and recognizes the risk and reports it. We need our law enforcement to take it really seriously and charge it. We need our victim advocates connecting them to the right resources, recognizing the urgency and safety planning. We need our prosecutors to charge it effectively and argue it. We need our judges to have harsh sentences for stalking, not harsh, but appropriate sentences for stalking offenders. And we need our probations and corrections folks to recognize stalking behaviors to make sure they continue to hold those offenders accountable. When we don't have this coordination across fields and across jurisdictions, these cases get lost. And when we look back, there's so many signs, but no one was quite connecting the dots. In terms of reporting the first response, just a few general things. Again, very few report to law enforcement. And there's reasons for that are, again, quite similar to for domestic and sexual violence. They might minimize it. They feel it's private. They didn't think the police would think it was important. And they might lack evidence. A lot of stalkers do not physically hurt the victim, or it takes a long time before they do that. And so they feel like, well, how can I prove that someone just came into my house and didn't take anything? But that's a really common stalker tactic, actually. They might feel they lack evidence. So in terms of safety planning, we want to know, what are victims afraid of? And most of them are afraid, or not most of them, but 46%, their number one fear is not knowing what would happen next. And of course, we're not fortune tellers. We don't know exactly what will happen next. But being able to identify the behavior of stalking, provide a brochure that explains stalking, some information about stalking, what are some other behaviors that might happen, can go a really long way in helping victims understand what's going on and what might happen next. And many fear the behavior will never stop because, again, those stalkers are so persistent. So we want to know what these fears are so that we can address them in our safety planning and in our provision of information. So when you're responding to victims, you definitely want to advise disengagement. And this is because offenders see any contact with the victim as a win. So if, the stalker calls 100 times, and the victim picks up and says, I hate you, stop calling me, we broke up, tomorrow the stalker's calling 101 times because they see any contact as a win. That being said, disengagement's not always possible or feasible for victims, especially in these intimate partner relationships. So, for example, we got a call because this case was being prosecuted, and it came out that the victim had called the abuser at 2 a.m. and they talked for 3 hours. So the defense was saying, well, how scared can she be? If she's so scared, why is she calling him? So we asked the victim, why did you call him? And she said, well, I called him because that's when he gets off work at the bar, so I was able to hear him get in his car, drive home, get in his bed, and fall asleep, so I knew he wouldn't come over, knock on the door, and yell and wake up my kids. So again, that, she's not calling him because she's not afraid. She's calling to kind of keep her enemies closer and take the temperature of that situation. And so, while yes, we want to advise disengagement, you also want to tell victims that you recognize that may not always be totally possible or feasible, and just be open so you can safety plan around those contacts, and also document those and see what happens, right? So it's not a surprise later. Documentation is really critical because, again, multiple incidents in multiple jurisdictions, but often we tell victims to document, but we don't tell them how. Like, we don't say what to actually document, so they end up saying, it was a windy day in Washington, wet, and that's not super helpful. So I can go back to that. We have an incident log on our website that's just the date, time, description of incident, location, if there were any witnesses, if police were called, and the officer name and badge number. And that's not to write up any officers necessarily. Sometimes I know they can bristle at that, but it's really just to make sure that we are pulling together this entire course of conduct and helping along that investigation and showing all of the incidents, because so often they get lost in different jurisdictions and positions. Like I said earlier, it can be helpful for a victim to tell an offender that they want to seize contact, and that is in terms of the case moving forward. If they have a documented notice to the offender saying, do not contact me, you are scaring me, and then that offender continues to contact them, that's pretty strong evidence. That's pretty compelling that the offender knows or should have known that their contact was unwanted. So depending on your statute, this might be more or less necessary. However, again, it can be a risk to victim safety and escalate the risk. So you want to talk to victims and figure out the best way to do that if you choose to do so. If you do choose to do so, though, here's some language that can be helpful, and this is on our website as well. Speaking of things on our website, I want to leave you with a few resources before we wrap up here. We have a safety planning guide for victims of stalking, so it has some guidance for how to be safe. Here's some things stalkers might do. Here's some planning tips for at home, at work, at school, online. Like I said earlier, a lot of times domestic violence organizations are tasked with responding to stalking, but not all stalking is domestic violence, and it may not be as emphasized on your website or organization. So do stalking victims know how to find you? We have a checklist on our website just to kind of help you think through that. Is the word stalking on your website? Do you share news articles about stalking? Do you share the Victim Connect hotline for victims of stalking as frequently as you share the one for the DV hotline or the RAIN hotline? So just some questions like that to get you thinking about it. Spark is based out of Equitas, the prosecutor's resource for violence against women. So for any prosecutors, or if you're working with prosecutors, definitely great help in 24/7 technical assistance available to help you better prosecute these kinds of cases, including stalking, as well as happy to go through your statute with you or anything like that. For law enforcement, the Cyber Center, this is a great tool that just helps law enforcement identify all the resources available for cybercrime labs, for finding those portals where they can put in subpoenas and things like that. There's also this great resource on gathering technology abuse evidence for court. So when you're looking at that evidence piece, it can be a bit confusing. Speaking of technology, the NNEDD Safety Net team does some great work on the use of technology to stalk and commit intimate partner violence. So this is a free app that you can download that gives you more information on how these tools can be used or misused, how to collect evidence, and how to safety plan around them. There's no national stalking hotline, unfortunately. The closest thing we have is Victim Connect, which is run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And so they'll help refer crime victims, including stalking victims, to the appropriate resources. So, you know, your domestic violence organization might be working with intimate partner-involved stalking victims, but if it's not intimate partner, this can be a great resource, or if it is. And of course, everybody's favorite website, stalkingawareness.org, training modules, resources for victims and practitioners, webinars. This one is being recorded and will be posted on there in the archives along with last week's, which I encourage you to listen to if you haven't. And again, we're on social media at Follow Us Legally. You can also sign up for our newsletter on our website. We email about quarterly just to highlight some new resources. Here's some of the things that we offer. If you're thinking, wow, I wish I could hear you talk even more, you might be in luck because we offer these webinars as well as in-person training. So you can request a training right through our website. National Stalking Awareness Month is in January, so I hope if you're promoting Domestic Violence Awareness Month, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, you're also getting ready for Stalking Awareness Month, and we house those materials there for social media. This is my contact information. I'll stick around in the room for a few minutes if you have any questions. I know I went just a little bit over time, so I want to respect your time. But I just want to thank you so much for taking the time and for, first of all, for all the important work that you're doing for victims and survivors every day, and for taking the time to learn a little bit more about intimate partner violence and stalking and the intersection. It's so important for Domestic Violence Awareness Month and all year round, and I really, really thank you for learning more about this and for all of your work. So please don't be a stranger. You know, reach out at any time. Always happy to send more resources or to talk you through any stalking situations you might be working with victims on. And with that, I will say have a great weekend, and I'll stick around in case any questions come in. So thanks so much. Someone asked, where can I find the webinar from last week? Great question. This is on, it will be on our archives page on stalkingawareness.org, so I will pull it up for you in just a second and send a link in the chat box. What are best practice resources for family court and custody or legal harassment? Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. There is a lot of what we call stalking through the courts. It could be, because anytime, again, that offender sees the victim, they consider it a win. And so they might be just, you know, a counterprotective order or custody or whatever it might be. In terms of resources for that, probably Equitas would be the best first place to go. So feel free to email me and follow up, and I'll see what I can get you for that. I don't have anything off the top of my head, but I know it's an issue that we've identified and definitely want to do more about. Okay, so looks like link is there. Patricia just shared an evaluation. Really appreciate your feedback on the webinar. If you can send that to me. And with